My talk will address briefly of course, is a Lent definition of the self. I'll say a little bit about reflections on value and the brain, which I think is very important. I happen to think that they are more emotion-based than rationalized, which is important in age. I say a little bit about brain structures and systems relevant for self-functions, and I've got two anatomical structures I'd like you to go home and remember today. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex. It seems to be activated when we do value choices, so it's important from that point of view. I see a little bit about emotion and cognition, how that interact with reference to empathy. And again, the anterior insular cortex is a very relevant and highly up-to-date neuroanatomical structure. And at the end, a few brief comments on aging and neurological dysfunction. Now, self is a well-established Norwegian theme. I'm not going to use much more time than to address Ibsen and Munch, which many of you will know. They were preoccupied with various aspects of self. Now, what is the self? I've taken this as my personal view. It's lent from someone else, but I think the self is a multidimensional mental construct or concept of a stable and limited identity. Now, it's important, self is more than the brain. Many of you read about the mind and the soul. We are not going to go into that today, but mind and soul for me is brain. Self is more than the brain. It's even more than the body. We have an interpersonal connectivity relating to self, as we have seen demonstrations of earlier today. The self is fragmented neurobiologically and psychologically, and of course, isolated fragments may be dysfunctional. Now, the self is expressed through so-called self-state, which is a repertoire of different modes of being in the world, and it includes bodily activation, thinking, feeling, and acting as a way of experiencing, combined with special images of oneself, certain dispositions to act, and a historical narrative based on memory. Now, the self defines value and meaning. We have heard about that today, and I'm trying to come back to this during my lecture. Value and meaning is for most of us real and fundamental. By the way, value may be more emotionally grounded than cognitively grounded. It's a topic in this lecture. The prefrontal cortex is a sort of a playing grounds of the self. And we have the lateral prefrontal cortex here, which is very important for our ability to initiate and execute plans when we are active and we want to do something. Reasoning is it very important for, and it's important for working memory. But in this connection, it's also interesting that this part of the brain may be involved in the control of empathy. I'll talk a little bit more about empathy later on. The medial prefrontal cortex is an essential part of this talk. This part of the brain here, which is very important, it seems, for motivation versus value. It seems involved in many aspects of self-reflection and so forth, and it's important for our ability to focus and attend. Now, the orbitofrontal cortex, this basic part of the brain, in our connection today, it seems most important for control of inhibiting the limbic system and the emotions in the brain. When testing self-reflection, a lot of studies now reveal activation here, here, and here in midline structures. Activation patterns are interesting because when you have a lot of studies, you may summate them and they may extrapolate into important hubs or areas having importance for connections in the brain. It doesn't mean that the function is localized there. Now, some of these areas I'm going to talk to may be also very relevant for localization aspects of some function, and noticeably the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and value. Now, we see that there are individual differences here, but when we look at the overall picture, there is two areas which are generally activated during self-reflection, and this is this dorsal area in the back of the brain here called the precuneus. It's important for mentalizing, for making mental images. And that's a very important area for that. That has been shown in many various test paradigms. And the other area important is the medial prefrontal cortex. This basic part are we going to talk a little bit more about. This is the ventromedial prefrontal area, and this is the dorsomedial. So it's a large area, but there are sub-areas important for various aspects, what I'm talking about today. Self-control in decision-making seems to involve modulation of the ventromedial prefrontal area, valuation system, this area here in the brain, and it seems that goal-directed decisions have their basis in value signals encoded in this ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And by the way, I think value decisions, emotionally based, may be one of the functions that are preserved longest, even in demented patients. So I'll come back to that. Exercising self-control is combined with the activation of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So these two areas sort of fight it out in different connections. Now, structures relevant to self-regulation and value are important in our connection, and this is the medial prefrontal area, the ventromedial down here, the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex here, and the medial prefrontal cortex encodes value signals and choices related to self and others, and there seems to be a ventral to dorsal gradient for self to others in quite a lot of studies. But again, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex is the most important for us. Interestingly, when we do value choices and when we evaluate changed rules, also in cognition, we seem to activate this tip of the brain. So this area is important for rule changes, value choices, but it seems that the values as such may be grounded in some ways in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Cognitive control, I've already talked a little bit about. Dorsolateral prefrontal cortex on the outside of the brain here. And there is an area in the superior temporal sulcus which is involved in this. These two areas I'll come back to because they are involved in various aspects here, but they are important for controlling attention and emotionally based decisions. As I said, they wait each other out in the discussion around these priorities for us. Now, salience seems to be expressed in more basic areas here. Salience of emotional and reward stimuli, including for empathy. These basic structures are generally better preserved in age than the cortical mantle, which seems to be most, let's say, affected during healthy aging as well as in disease. Now, Antonio Damasio may be known for some of you. He has written extensively on this, and he has fathered the somatic marker hypothesis. He wrote in 2005 that we believe that there was a biological blueprint for the intelligent construction of human values, and emotions already embody such values. Now, the biological blueprint of or for human values can be found in the machinery of homeostasis. Now, we talk really basic neurobiology and physiology. And he says that states of pleasure and reward lead to health and well-being, relevant for our opinion of good and evil, beautiful and ugly, and is relevant for our concern for others, empathy. These processes elicit efficient states. Why talk about this? This is a biological scenery where emotion and value decisions seems to be based very basic in the brain. The structure for eliciting decisions connected to value are old structures in the brain. Some of these are animal research. They don't have our degree of empathy, but they also have a value world. Animals do a lot of decisions based on value evaluation. Okay, social emotions are action programs, and in that sense, he has been looking on different brain systems that he thinks is essential as a grounding for human values. And to extract from his writings, I've included this: brain systems necessary for social emotions, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex; brain systems necessary for experiencing emotional feelings, anterior insular cortex. Emotions and feelings are not the same. I might come back to that if you're interested in it. Feelings have a cortical, or a cognitive component which basic emotions do not have. That's the difference between emotion and feeling. The triggering for social emotions are emotionally competent stimuli. And this is also from his writings. How do we react, and what happens when we are exposed to emotionally competent stimuli? We react with social empathy. Now, there are a lot of people who think when you are exposed to something emotionally, you start thinking about it, and you think even more about it. You reason, and you reason again. And of course we do. But many biological, including clinical studies, do indicate that your primary reaction is social emotions. So your primary guiding in some of the value questions when you are exposed to this is emotion-based and not reason-based. And of course, reasoning may interact with emotion. He has somewhat changed his opinion over the years, but I think it's correct to say that his main hypothesis still is that reasoning is secondary to this emotionally competent stimulus and our reaction to that. Okay, still more studies. Neurobasis of human moral cognition. Assumed moral cognitions detected in various testings paradigms seems to activate this area that I've been discussing, but also the superior temporal gyrus and an area in front here in the polar tip of the temporal lobe. And here we see another study indicating the prefrontal cortex here, precuneus, as I already told you about, activation in questions of morality. I'll come back to a very similar picture of activation like this one. Now, conceptually, integration of cognition and emotion may be a two-way self-regulatory system. A top-down cognitive control process, you know, the neocortex, the higher level in the brain, interact with the deeper, more basic and the older structures in the brain. And we may have a bottom-up emotional, motivational process regulating cognition. And of course, these two processes, they interact. So, it's not possible quite to eliminate or to separate emotion and cognition. So this, I think, reflects the real picture. Cognition and emotion overlap in many situations. When you heavily discuss the ideas of a publication or a philosophical theme, you are up here. When you start discussing what the author could have felt when he wrote about it, you wander into this area here. Also, neuroanatomically, you use different areas of the brain, intellectually discussing, reasoning about ideas, and thinking about feeling. So these are very important anatomical findings that has been substantiated over the last decades. What I present to you today is actually data, I think it's right to say, which are not, there are no conflicts around this. Most people accept the neurobiological, let's say, grounding of these ideas. But of course, it's a little bit more complicated. This is the default mode network. This is the activation pattern in the brain when our mind wanders. We think about something, we don't execute, we think. We ruminate. Okay? Medial prefrontal cortex, precuneus, as I told you, and the temporal lobe. At the back of the temporal lobe, the temporoparietal junction. This area is important for theory of mind. When we mentalize ourselves and others, it's activated during thinking around morality, moral questions, and thinking about others' ideas. By the way, this is the activation pattern in the default mode state. This is what it looks like when we execute, when we say, okay, no, I have to do something. No, I have to make a plan. You go from the default mode system, and then you activate the lateral parts of the brain. I have to do something. I have to make a plan, and I have to execute. But it's even more complicated. On the lateral part of the brain, we have something called the mirror neuron system. When I see someone with a warm cup of coffee and I really look at the person, I can feel that cup in my own hand. This is what the mirror neuron system is about. Now, artists use this, people in the theater, health personnel, other will have to use this. It's not empathy, but it may help empathy. Okay, in aging, it's important to see aging in a socio-cultural context. We have heard about that today. Stereotypes of concepts of age seems to be established in many ways in childhood. It's a good thing that we may alter our concepts during life. But I think the grounding of the concept of what old people are, we carry with us from childhood. Is there a cognitive decline? Yes, there is. Also in healthy aging, but it doesn't have to be very much, actually. And what we are good at earlier in life, we stay good at. we may not be so good at learning new things. Memory decline, yes, and memory for the future seems to be more affected than our memory going back. What about emotion? Well, in health, emotion seems to be fairly stable in age. And that's important. I think we have seen an example of the relevance of emotion in the previous two lectures. We can theorize about it, but actually it has something to do with emotion. What about humor? Humor is more appreciated, less fine-tuned understanding, but it's a very important coping mechanism in aging. In disease and age generation, impaired self-functions may, of course, occur. Reappraisal ability increase linearly with age. This is interesting, in healthy age, of course. Older adults report more emotional stability and greater ratio of positive to negative experience in their daily life. They may have a more effective emotional regulation. And these structures atrophy to a lesser degree than the cortical mantle. So we are able to sustain emotional, let's say, regulatory mechanisms longer than we are related to cognitive abilities. The strategies older adults deploy with spared or greater regulatory ability, shown for strategies and tactics that fit with long-term goals, have become habitual. And that means actually that if we see atrophy in an area, that doesn't mean that you have to really find an impaired function. It may be that the connections are simply more effective. Now, motivation and reward in healthy aging is unaltered or even increased, enhanced. There is a small structure down here. This is an area which we have already discussed, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. There is a small area here called nucleus accumbens. All the gratifying responses occur or are regulated here by dopamine. This seems to be relatively well spared during aging. So I think contentment in age is living a positive and meaningful life with compassion for self and others. There are a lot of associations to this, but empathy is very central. And an important area for empathy is insula, where we have emotional awareness. Our awareness of own and others' feelings are connected at least with strong activation in this area, in the anterior parts. Now, insula integrates perception, emotion, and thought, and elicits feeling, which is, let's say, emotions with a cognitive superstructure or a cognitive context. So it's sort of a neurobiologically a higher grounded function. In this area, by the way, there has been reports of epileptic seizure activity with enhanced self-awareness. Moreover, functional studies have shown that areas activated by emotions are also activated when we evaluate information related to empathy. So this is an area where we see, virtually visualize the linking between emotion and empathy. Very briefly, we talk about effective empathy, which is the warm feeling, das Einfühlen, which is connected with activation in the anterior insula, whereas the more cooler cognitive empathy seems to be connected with activation in more cortical areas, but again in this midline structure that I've been talking about. It's even more complicated. Time is running out for me, but I would like to include one other phenomenon likely involved in empathy. It's the von Economo neurons. I've been talking to you about the default mode network, the ventromedial prefrontal cortical area, where in many ways value decisions and grounding of emotions seems to be not localized, but if you get lesions in this area, you are not able to understand feelings in others and or to react to emotion in others. And the mirror neuron system, as I told you, may at least be partly involved in empathy. And these neurons, which are large neurons with a very high degree of connectivity, widespread connectivity, are localized in specific areas and may have an involvement with other structures in empathy regulation in brain. So these structures here, the midline structures, the prefrontal area, and this specific area or rectangle here, the medial prefrontal cortex, the insula, and basic parts of the frontal brain seems to be very crucial for empathy. So, I wanted to include this slide. People thinking about thinking people, okay? You see which kind of brain area you activate during this meeting, okay? But as I told you, the more you think about the emotions, the more you wander into the basic structures here. This is from a recent summary where one has looked at changing not only cortical area and volume, but also the tracts between these areas in the brain. And they have been correlated with test results. Now, we may see an atrophy in volume and area, and even in tracts, without defects in functional measurements, at least. So, again, as we get older, we may get more efficient. But of course, if you lose very much substance, you may get into trouble. So, I'd like to conclude with a few slides related to epileptic seizure, which is my daily work. This is an artist who has made a picture of her seizures, even feeling out of the body or dissociation and loss of control, fragmentation of self and epileptic seizures. She is young, but we see quite a lot of this type of seizures in aging people, even more. And this is one example of one patient that we had some years back. He was diagnosed with dementia. He had a normal EEG. A long story short, he functioned fairly well. Then he had days where he was confused. He had a sort of an aphasia, altered his behavior, and he was diagnosed with dementia when he was examined by others in this situation. So he came to us in the epilepsy department. We saw an absolutely normal EEG when he functioned normally. Then he went into this situation where he had been examined earlier. EEG changed. It was sort of switching on something in the middle of the night. 2 days later, he was switched off. He had a dementia problem for 2 days, and then he normalized again. Okay. Epileptic seizures with altered self-control and self-cognition. He was treated and had 5 very good years before he died of something else. Self and Tourette syndrome is a topic which is interesting in itself, but Tourette syndrome improves with age. So there is still hope for dysfunction of self in aging. Empathy may be reduced in age due to disinhibition of self-perspective, and I think it's fair to say that many studies of old people exaggerate the cognitive decline, because when you follow up on these tests and you take the patient populations and you examine them later on, even with an autopsy, you see that some of these patients were already impaired due to a dementia. So many reports on cognitive decline are falsely exaggerated. So, okay, I conclude with this slide. Self, a personal sum up. The self is a multidimensional mental concept and so forth. Aging may impair cognition more than emotion and values. And I think the last talk demonstrated that nicely with a severely demented patient, which I think had an emotional bond to the little one. So, thank you.